Think you know the whole story? Turns out you were probably taught the half-truth. Welcome to Half-Truths. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a history class diorama, maybe one you made in middle school out of a shoebox and some clay figures. The scene is colonial America. The year, 1692. The place, a small, God-fearing village called Salem. In the center of your diorama, there's a crude wooden post. A woman is tied to it, her face a mask of terror. Around her, villagers with grim faces and pitchforks hold flaming torches. The fire licks at the kindling piled around her feet. This is the Salem witch trials. It's the image we all know. It's the scene from movies, the stuff of Halloween legends, the dramatic climax of Arthur Miller's The Crucible that we all read in high school. 19 people, accused of consorting with the devil, were put to death in a wave of paranoia and hysteria. They were sentenced by a court that accepted spectral evidence, the idea that a ghost or spirit could do harm at the bidding of a witch, and they were executed in the most dramatic, terrifying way imaginable. They were burned at the stake. It's a story we've heard so many times that it feels as solid as bedrock. A foundational American horror story. The details are etched in our minds. The accusations, the trials, and the purifying flames that consumed the guilty. It's a powerful, elemental image. Fire is cleansing. It's righteous. It represents a community casting out its ultimate evil in a blaze of judgment. The burning witch is a symbol that resonates through centuries, a warning of what happens when religious fervor and superstition run amok. We accept it without question. Of course they were burned. That's what you do with witches. But what if that story, that central, searing image at the heart of the tragedy, isn't the whole story? What if the most memorable detail, the one that makes the horror so cinematic, the one that defines the entire event in our popular culture, never actually happened? What if I told you that in the colony of Massachusetts in 1692, not a single person convicted of witchcraft was burned at the stake? Not one. The half-truth we're dissecting today is one of smoke and mirrors, a tale where the imagined fire has cast a much longer shadow than the horrifying and very different truth. To understand why the myth of the Salem burnings is so powerful, we first have to immerse ourselves in the story we all think we know. It begins in the bleak winter of 1692, in the small, isolated village of Salem, a frontier outpost of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This was a Puritan world, a society built on a rigid and demanding interpretation of Protestantism. For the people of Salem, the world was a battlefield between God and Satan, and the devil was not some abstract concept. He was real, an active and malevolent force constantly seeking to corrupt the souls of the faithful and tear their godly community apart from within. Life was hard, the winters were brutal, disease was common, and the threat of attack from surrounding Native American tribes was a constant fear. In this pressure cooker of anxiety and piety, any misfortune, a failed crop, a sick child, a sudden death, could be interpreted as a sign of God's displeasure, or worse, the work of the devil's agents on earth, witches. The spark lands in the home of the Reverend Samuel Parris. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, begin to exhibit terrifying and inexplicable behaviors. They have fits. They scream, contort their bodies into unnatural shapes, and complain of being pinched and pricked by invisible forces. When a local doctor can find no physical cause, he offers a chilling diagnosis. They are bewitched. The question, then, is who is doing the bewitching? Pressured to name their tormentors, the girls point their fingers at three women on the margins of Salem society. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman embroiled in a property dispute, and Tituba, the Paris family's enslaved servant from the Caribbean. Tituba, under intense questioning and likely coercion, confesses. She spins wild tales of a black dog, a yellow bird, and signing the devil's book. Her confession is the confirmation the villagers needed. The devil was loose in Salem. What follows is a contagion of fear. The circle of accusers widens to include other young women who seem to gain a shocking amount of power and influence in this deeply patriarchal society. The accusations multiply, spreading from social outcasts to respected church members. Anyone could be next. A muttered curse, a strange look, a dispute over land, all could be twisted into evidence of witchcraft. The colony establishes a special court to hear the cases, and the trials begin. And this is where our collective memory really kicks in. We picture these dramatic trials, the screaming accusers fainting in the courtroom, the magistrates demanding confessions, and then the verdict, guilty. The sentence, death. And in the final, dramatic act, we see the condemned being led to a public square, tied to a post, and consumed by flames as the town looks on, convinced they have purged the evil from their midst. It's a terrifying, almost medieval scene, a stark illustration of religious extremism. It's a story of a society gone mad, culminating in a fiery spectacle that serves as a permanent stain on American history. This narrative is compelling because it's simple and it's symbolic. It fits a pattern of religious persecution we've seen elsewhere in history. The imagery is potent. The idea of fire as a tool to destroy heresy and purify a community connects to a deeper, older European story. It feels right. It feels historically resonant. The problem is, for Salem, it's almost entirely wrong. The trials happened. The accusations were real. The paranoia was devastating. But the fire is a ghost, an imported memory from another continent and another time. So, if they weren't burned, what happened? And where did this powerful, persistent myth of the Salem witch burnings come from? To find the answer, we have to start pulling on the thread, and the first place to look is in the one place the mythmakers seem to have ignored: the actual historical records. The court documents from the Salem witch trials are surprisingly detailed. We have transcripts of the examinations, the indictments, the petitions, and the death warrants. They are chilling to read, a bureaucratic catalog of a community devouring itself. And in these documents, the method of execution is stated plainly, over and over again. For the 19 people sentenced to death by the court of Oyer and Terminer, the sentence was not burning. It was hanging. The official order was always the same, that the condemned be hanged by the neck until dead. This wasn't an arbitrary choice. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, despite its religious foundations, was an English colony. It operated under English common law. And under the English Witchcraft Act of 1604, which was the legal precedent for the colonies, witchcraft was a felony. In the English legal system of the 17th century, the standard punishment for felonies was death by hanging. It was the same punishment you'd receive for murder, theft, or piracy. For the English, and by extension their American colonists, witchcraft was a crime against the state, not primarily a crime against the church. This is the crucial distinction. The image of burning at the stake comes from a different legal and religious tradition entirely. It was the preferred method of execution for heresy in continental Europe, especially during the Spanish Inquisition and the great witch hunts in the Holy Roman Empire, which today is mostly Germany. In that context, witchcraft was seen as a theological crime, a betrayal of God. The purpose of burning was deeply symbolic. Fire was believed to purify the soul, but more importantly, it utterly destroyed the physical body, preventing a witch from being resurrected on Judgment Day. It was a sentence designed to erase the heretic from both earthly and heavenly existence. The European witch hunts were a completely different beast from what happened in Salem. They lasted for centuries, not months. They resulted in the deaths of an estimated 40 to 50,000 people, not 19, and they were often driven by Catholic and Protestant inquisitorial courts that used torture to extract confessions and had a deep theological investment in burning. The colonists in Salem, on the other hand, were English Puritans. They feared the devil, but their legal framework was English, and the English hanged their witches. So why the confusion? It's a case of historical conflation, a blending of two separate, though related, phenomena. Over time, the massive, fiery European witch hunts became the generic template for all witch hunts in the popular imagination. And Salem, being the most famous witch hunt in American history, simply absorbed the most dramatic and gruesome details of its European predecessors. We've essentially photoshopped the flames of Germany onto the landscape of Massachusetts. This conflation was helped along by centuries of art and literature. 19th century artists and writers, fascinated by the Gothic and the macabre, often depicted the Salem trials with all the fiery trappings of the European version because it was simply more dramatic. A hanging is a grim, sordid affair, but a burning is a spectacle. It's biblical. It's apocalyptic. And so, generation after generation, the story was told with the wrong climax. Arthur Miller's The Crucible, while a masterpiece of drama and a powerful allegory for McCarthyism, also plays fast and loose with historical details for theatrical effect, further cementing the popular narrative. We remember the emotional truth of the play and the fiery imagery it evokes, more than the historical facts. The myth is also a product of a kind of historical shorthand. It's easier to lump all witch trials together under the single terrifying banner of burning at the stake than it is to understand the legal and cultural distinctions between a trial in Heidelberg in 1580 and a trial in Salem in 1692. The half-truth persists because it's a simpler, more powerful story. But the real story, the one found in the court records and the historical context, is not only more accurate, it reveals something much more specific and perhaps more unsettling about the nature of the Salem tragedy. Freed from the distracting and inaccurate imagery of fire, we can now look at what actually happened in Salem in 1692. The reality is, in many ways, more mundane and therefore more chilling. The executions were not a grand theatrical spectacle of religious purification. They were state-sanctioned killings carried out with the cold, brutal efficiency of the law. The 19 men and women who were convicted of witchcraft were not taken to the town square. They were taken to a barren, rocky hill on the outskirts of town known as Proctor's Ledge, now confirmed by historians to be the true Gallows Hill. There was no pyre, no crowd holding torches aloft. There was just a gallows, or more likely a large tree, and a rope. The condemned were loaded onto a cart. The noose was placed around their neck, and the cart was simply pulled away, leaving them to strangle to death. It was a slow, agonizing, and profoundly humiliating end. The first to be executed on June 10th was Bridget Bishop. She was a tavern owner who had a reputation for being outspoken and wearing provocative clothing, a red bodice, which was scandalous to the Puritans. She maintained her innocence to the very end. On July 19th, 5 more were hanged, including Rebecca Nurse, a respected elderly matriarch of the community. Her execution sent a shockwave through the colony. If someone as pious as Rebecca Nurse could be a witch, then no one was safe. As she stood on the gallows, the Reverend Nicholas Noyes urged her to confess, saying, "What a sad thing it is to see 9 executioners in hell." Nurse replied, "I am innocent, and God will clear my innocency." The hangings continued through the summer and into the fall. Among the executed were both women and men, including the Reverend George Burroughs, the only minister executed during the trials. He shocked the crowd at his hanging on August 19th by flawlessly reciting the Lord's Prayer, something a witch was supposedly incapable of doing. The crowd began to murmur, to question whether an innocent man was about to be killed. But the influential minister Cotton Mather, sitting on his horse, assured the public that the devil was capable of great deception, and the execution proceeded. And then there's the story of Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer. His case is unique and especially brutal, and it also had nothing to do with fire. Corey, seeing the writing on the wall, refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. Under English law at the time, a person who refused to plead could not be tried. This was a problem for the court, but they had a solution, a medieval legal procedure called peine forte et dure. Corey was taken to an open field, stripped naked, and had a wooden board placed on his chest. Heavy stones were then piled on the board, one by one, to crush him into submission. For 2 days he lay there, refusing to utter a word except, as legend has it, to call for more weight. He died under the immense pressure, his property passing to his sons because he was never technically convicted of a felony. He was pressed to death, a form of legal torture so archaic that it was almost never used. Yet it happened right there in colonial Massachusetts. By replacing the fire with the gallows and the stones, the story of Salem changes. It becomes less a tale of religious hysteria run wild, though that was certainly a factor, and more a story of a catastrophic failure of the legal system. The magistrates, many of whom had no legal training, abandoned centuries of English legal precedent. They allowed spectral evidence, hearsay, and forced confessions to condemn their neighbors. They executed people based on the word of a handful of traumatized or manipulative young women. The horror of Salem isn't found in a bonfire of fanaticism, but in the cold, procedural breakdown of a society's most basic safeguards. It's a story about due process being replaced by paranoia, about the law becoming a weapon of personal vengeance and social anxiety. The trials finally ended, not because of a sudden return to reason, but because the accusers got too ambitious. They began naming people who were too powerful, too well-connected, including the wife of the colonial governor, William Phips. At that point, Governor Phips stepped in, dissolved the special court, and eventually pardoned the remaining accused. The nightmare was over, but the aftermath was one of deep shame and regret. Judges and jurors issued public apologies. Samuel Sewall, one of the main magistrates, stood in church years later as his confession of error and guilt was read aloud, asking for forgiveness from both God and the community. It was a recognition that the legal system, in its attempt to root out evil, had become the greatest evil of all. We began with a simple, fiery myth. Salem burned its witches at the stake. It's a story that is easy to remember and easy to tell, a dramatic tale of puritanical fury. But as we've seen, that story is a half-truth, an imported legend that obscures a more complex and disturbing reality. By pulling on the thread of that single, iconic image, we unraveled a completely different narrative. The truth is that the 19 victims of the Salem witch trials were hanged in accordance with English law. One man was pressed to death for refusing to stand trial. The absence of fire is not a minor detail. It's the key that unlocks a more accurate understanding of the event. The myth of burning connects Salem to a long, brutal history of European religious persecution, turning it into a timeless horror story. The reality of the gallows grounds the tragedy in a specific time and place. It was not a medieval holy war against heresy. It was a colonial legal crisis. So why does correcting this myth matter? It matters because understanding the how helps us understand the why. The story of Salem is not about the spectacular evil of a cleansing fire. It is about the quiet, procedural, and bureaucratic evil that can arise when fear overwhelms reason, when a community turns on its own, and when the institutions designed to protect people, the courts, the law, become the very instruments of their destruction. The real horror of Salem is not that it looks like the Spanish Inquisition. The horror is that it looks a little too much like us. It reminds us that justice is fragile and that the line between order and chaos is thinner than we think. The myth of the burning witch allows us to keep the story at a safe, historical distance, to see it as a product of a superstitious, bygone era we have long since outgrown. But the truth of the gallows, of a failed legal process, and a society consumed by suspicion, feels uncomfortably modern. It's a warning that the specters that haunted Salem, fear of the other, the power of accusation, and the collapse of civic trust were never fully banished. The scariest monsters aren't always the ones that command fire and brimstone. Sometimes, they are the ones that command a courtroom. Now you know the real story. What other half-truths are still out there? If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment, and join us next time. Until then, stay curious.